The title for this message, as we see here, is Life, Death, and Two Birds. And we're going to be talking about leprosy. So how many of you have had a skin disease before? Any type of skin disease? You have. So there was one time I moved here to the East Coast, and we went to this camp meeting, and you never imagine that things like this are going to happen to you. And so we went to this camp meeting. The place was very nice, and at some point, to drop it? Okay. All right. So at some point, there were some issues with the bathrooms, right? So nothing serious. And it happened with the bathrooms of the guys. So somebody had this brilliant idea to go ahead and put some toilet paper in the toilets. And as you can imagine, one of the toilets clogged up, and the water started rising. And as I'm coming in, I'm walking, with my sandals, and I see all of this water on the floor, and there were some brown pieces of what appeared to be feces, right? So some of the guys were scheduled that day to go ahead and make sure to keep the bathrooms clean. As you might know, most of the guys would have issues, trying to keep it clean, and our bathroom was not the cleanest. But when we had this little accident, everybody stepped to the plate and they said, we're going to go and we're going to clean this up. But I don't know who had this wonderful idea to go and to grab the mop that was in the kitchen, that was used to mop the kitchen area, and bring it to go ahead and suck up all the water that was there in the bathroom. And to make matters worse, that same mop was used also to mop our rooms, and to clean them, to clean the cabins. So of course, I was walking in the room, and I saw that the floor was just recently cleaned, and I thought this would be a good time to remove my shoes, walk around. It's in this part of the country, it's very humid. So I'm walking around barefooted, feeling the nice, cool, recently mopped floor, and nothing happens. It was a great camp meeting. I come back home. A few days later, I begin to get some rashes in my feet. So the first thing that you do is you start Googling and try to self-diagnose what's going on. And at first I thought, it's maybe just the humidity. Things happen. I'm not used to it. And as I kept researching, and these, they were kind of like, not boils, but they were kind of like a lot of huge pimples that were ready to explode. And I began to notice that they were growing and they were spreading on the sole of my feet. And based on what I was able to gather, it seemed that I had what they call mouth and hand and foot disease. I don't know if that's how, yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, and Mikey can correct me if I'm wrong, it usually babies and children will get these, not necessarily adults. So, it started getting worse, and I said, I need to go to the doctor. So I went, and sure enough, that's what I had. And it was very, very painful. The worst part of it was that you can't scratch it, and if you do, it'll open up, and you can get it in your hands. And it got so worse that I had to spend about an amount of 3 weeks, in the house, and I couldn't walk. I couldn't put my foot on the floor. So what I did was I got my office chair. And in order to, either give the Bible studies or any Zoom meetings, I had to, wheel myself around with the office chair to and from the restroom. And when I had to get some mail that was upstairs, I had to crawl on my feet and go and grab the mail because I just simply couldn't walk. And this reminded me of some of the diseases and skin diseases that are mentioned in the Bible, and specifically the disease of leprosy. And this is what we're going to be studying today. So we're going to go to Isaiah. All right, Isaiah. There we go. Isaiah 53, 8 through 9, and it says, "For he was cut off from the land of the living," talking about Jesus. "For the transgressions of my people he was stricken, and he made his grave with the wicked." So how can Jesus relate to somebody that had leprosy? Throughout the Bible, we see that leprosy is always, it's made a parallel to sin. So we're going to look at the story of a leper. And in Ministry of Healing, it starts by telling us that in the region of Christ's ministry were many of these sufferers, and as the news of his work reached them, there is one in whose heart faith began to spring up, if he could go to Jesus, that he might be healed. If you have a skin disease and you've had it for a very long time, leprosy was one of those. It's something that could not be cured. And one of the first things that would happen to the lepers was you had to be bandaged to where everybody had leprosy, and you couldn't be even with your family. So think about COVID. What was one of the most challenging aspects when you got COVID? Separation. Besides the sleepless nights, I guess you could kind of get over that. But the biggest one was separation. And the worst part was that even when you had a loved one that had COVID, you couldn't even see them in the hospital. So just imagine leprosy being one of these diseases in which your loved one has to be banished away and everything around it was contaminated. So it was the same case with this leper. And she continues to say, but how can he find Jesus? It says, doomed as he is to perpetual isolation, how can he present himself to the healer? Somebody that was completely healthy, and this is the same reaction we have when we realize what our sin is, right? How can you come before God, who is a holy God? And it says, and will Christ heal him? This was the biggest question he had. How can I present myself to Jesus? Right? He's perfect. And the other one was, how can he heal me? And the next was, will he not, like the Pharisees and even the physicians, pronounce a curse upon him and warn him to flee from the haunts of men? He thinks of all that has been told him of Jesus, not one who has sought his help has been turned away. So imagine, this guy is sick, and he knows one thing. He's heard a lot of stories, and one of the things that come to his mind is, none of them that have gone to Christ have ever been turned away. Christ has rejected nobody. So he thinks, I probably have a chance. And so what was he experiencing? It says, though shut from the cities, it may be that he can cross his path in some byway along the mountain roads, or find, as he is teaching outside of towns, the difficulties are great, but this is his only hope. So, as he's getting closer to Christ, he's able to catch a little bit of what Christ is saying. And he begins to hear some of the words that Jesus is saying, and his faith, she later says that his faith strengthens. So if you're in a position where you can't change yourself, and this is always the case with sin, where you can't change yourself, what is one of the things that is going to spark your trust in God, and that God can actually change you is what? The stories of somebody that has actually been changed. And it is the same thing with the leper here. So he gets near, he approaches, this multitude, but one of the first things that began to happen to him is that people begin to push him away. Because again, remember, he's a leper, and if you touch him, you're going to get the same disease. And it's interesting how Ellen White describes this spectacle from everybody's perspective. She says, he is a loathsome spectacle to everyone around him. It says, the disease has made fruitful inroads, and his decaying body is horrible to look upon. At sight of him, the people fall back in their terror. The crowd upon one another, to escape from contact with him. So can you imagine, he's getting closer, and people are terrified, because that means that any contact with the leper, they're going to also get this disease. And she even says, some try to prevent him from approaching Jesus. And of course, you had those that love Jesus, and they think that if he touches the leper, he's also going to get the disease. But in vain, he neither sees nor hears their expressions of loathing are lost upon him. He sees only the Son of God. He hears only the voice that speaks life to the dying. So I would like us to go. We're going to go now to Matthew. And so the leper comes to him, he bows down to him, and he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." So then in verse 3, Jesus stretches out his hand and touches him and saying, "I'm willing, be cleansed," and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. But then Jesus tells him to do something very specific. He says, "And Jesus said to him, 'See that you tell no one, but go yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses had commanded as a testimony to them.'" So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at how is that leprosy was dealt with in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament, and some of the lessons that we can learn and apply to our Christian life. So let's look at some of the characteristics here. So the first one, so there's a lot of debate on what type of disease this actually is. But most biblical scholars agree that this leprosy kind of disease is what we now know as Hansen's disease. I don't know if it's common here in the U.S., but I know that specifically in India, there's a lot of these diseases and skin-related diseases. So the first one that we see is found in Numbers 12, verse 12, and this is how it's described. It says, "Oh, do not let her be like one dead whose flesh is half eaten away." And if you remember, this is when Miriam gets leprosy. And when she gets leprosy, this is how Moses described leprosy. So just imagine your flesh is eating away, and in other parts, even the Jewish rabbis, they describe it as your flesh was it would fall off into pieces. The worse it got, your flesh will start to come off, and you would eventually, what would happen is you would lose some parts of your hair. And the other one that would also happen, which I believe is the worst thing that you could possibly experience, is that it attacks your nervous system. So what would happen is you would not be able to blink. So what happens when you don't blink? Your eyes are not moisturized. You begin to lose your eyesight. So that was one of the characteristics. You would begin to lose your eyesight, but there was another one that I believe is the worst. Since this attacks their nervous system and also their muscles, even if you were present with a leper, if you would get close to them, you know how you have this feeling, let's say that you're in a room and somebody's in the room, you can kind of sense that somebody has entered into the room. Even if you don't hear anything, you kind of sense that somebody's there, right? You felt that. Or sometimes you even felt that somebody might be watching you. So when somebody's present, you feel that they're there. And what the leper could not feel is if somebody entered the room, they would not be able to feel that there was nobody in the room, even if there was quite a crowd around them. And the other one was that even if they were to touch them, even to caress their hand, they couldn't feel anything. An embrace they could not feel. So it was a very isolating disease. And that is why, and actually we'll get into that later on. So Leviticus 13:45, talking about the lepers, "As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes has to be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry unclean." So when we look at how the leper was supposed to react to this disease, we find out that it's equivalent to how somebody that had lost a loved one should react. So how was somebody that had lost a loved one should react? They had to go ahead and put ashes upon themselves. They had to cry out. And in this case, since they would be losing parts of their hair, they had to make it evident that they had leprosy. So they had to let people know that they were sick. And later on, even if you remember when we go to Job 14:22, in Job 14:22, the Bible doesn't tell us whether or not Job had leprosy, but based on the symptoms, it was some sort of very bad skin disease. And the way that Job describes it in Job 14:22, it says, "However, his body pains him," he was talking about himself, "and his soul mourns for himself." So when somebody had leprosy, they had to do some sort of mourning, but the ironic part was that they were mourning for themselves. And it was kind of like somebody that was dead walking, like the walking dead. This is how they described it. And in Ministry of Healing, this is how Ellen White describes it. It says, "Of all the diseases known in the East, the leprosy was most dreaded." And she says, "Its incurable and contagious character and its horrible effect upon its victim filled the bravest with fear. And then by the ritual law, the leper was pronounced unclean. Whatever he touched was unclean. The air was polluted by his breath, like one already dead. So it is only fit that they would exhibit the same characteristics of somebody that had died. He was shut out from the habitations of man. So if pronounced a leper, he was isolated from his family, cut off from the congregation of Israel, and doomed to associate with those only who were similarly afflicted. Now, there's this doctor, and I believe he passed away, and his name was Dr. Paul Brand, and he spent a lot of time, with people with this kind of skin disease. And this is what he writes in one of his books. He says, "Many cannot feel even when another person holds their hands or caresses them." So think about how sin is. When we're plagued with sin, even the embrace of somebody else, you're not able to feel it. So what is the first thing when somebody is, dead in trespasses, as Paul put it? What is the first thing that a sinner cannot feel? What is the first question that they'll have? First of all is there a God? They're not going to be able to feel God's presence. And when they pray, what they usually tell me is, I feel that God is really not listening. This is a symptom of somebody that has leprosy. They can't feel the presence of somebody that is there, even if you touch them. Now, what was the process in cleansing in the sanctuary? And this is going to teach us a lot about how is it that God works with us as sinners. So in Leviticus 13:47, we see that they were very particular when it came to leprosy. And it says, when a garment has a mark of leprosy in it, whether it is a wool garment or linen, something had to happen. It is a mark, is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather or in the wrap or in the woof or even any article of leather. It is a leper's mark, and it shall be shown to the priest. So remember, the temple and the sanctuary was all about imagery. So what does your clothing represent according to the Bible? What does your clothing represent for us as Christians? Character, right. So what was the message to a Jewish person who had leprosy? So you as an individual, you have leprosy, and even your clothing, whatever you do, your character is tainted with what? Is tainted with leprosy. And what has to be cleansed? You have to be cleansed as a person, but what else has to be cleansed? Your clothing has to change. You can't use the same clothing. So this had to come before the priest. And then in Leviticus 13:50, it says, then the priest shall look at the mark and shall quarantine the article with a mark for 7 days. And then in verse 51, the mark is a leprous malignancy, it is unclean. And in the next verse 52, so what happened to the garment that was contaminated? So he shall burn the garment, whether the wrap or the wool, and for it is a leprous malignancy, it shall be burned in the fire. So very powerful lessons. Your justice or your works, what needs to happen to them? You as a leper, everything that you do is already tainted with what? It's already tainted with leprosy. It's sin. So what has to happen to this? It has to be burnt. And then the next verses, it says, but if the priest shall look, and indeed the mark has not spread in the garment, then in verse 54, then the priest shall order them to wash the one thing in which the mark occurs, and he shall quarantine it for 7 days. Now, let's think about this for a second, and we're going to get into it in a bit. In the next verse, it says, after the article where the mark has been washed, the priest shall again look, and if the mark has not changed its appearance, even though the mark has not spread, it is unclean, you shall burn it with fire. So they kind of went through a process in which they look at the clothes, and if the mark had not grown, but it was still there, it was still considered to be an active, leprous mark. And they were done until they couldn't see anything, right? And one of the things that I would like us to look at is in this next verse, Leviticus 14 and verse 4. So if we read Leviticus 14, we'll see the whole process that once you had been healed, you had to come to the priest, and the priest would look at you and make sure that you had been cleansed. But look what it says here. Then the priest shall command to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 living clean birds. And now look at the things that are used. So you had 2 birds, a cedar wood, you had scarlet, and then you had what else? you had hyssop. So what does hyssop remind us? And later on, we're going to get into David's prayer in Psalm 51 and how David's prayer was a prayer of a leper. Because remember, what does David use in his prayer? Purify me and cleanse me with what? He's asking God to cleanse him with hyssop. So, in Desire of Ages 256, it says, the same priest who condemned the leper to banishment certified his cure. And it is the same thing with sin. So, the priest who condemned the leopard and who assessed the leopard and said, you have this disease, that very same priest was the one that was going to certify him as clean. And it is the same thing that happens with us. What happened in the Garden of Eden? Jesus comes down. Adam and Eve have sinned, but Jesus is also the one that certifies their healing. Now, going to Ephesians 2:1, this is how it describes us as human beings. It says, and you hath he quickened who are dead in trespasses and sins. We're alive, but we're dead in trespasses and sin. And these are 3 quotes from Ellen White where she describes leprosy. And she says, leprosy of strife and dissension, selfish grasping spirit like leprosy, and covetousness like leprosy. And these are all attitudes and behaviors that cause leprosy in a lot of people. And if you remember the story of Miriam, what happened with Miriam? What did she begin to do? She was selfish. She began to covet, Moses' position, and it turned into leprosy. And then in Desire of Ages 266, thus it is with the leprosy of sin, deep-rooted, deadly, and impossible to be cleansed by human power. Now let us go ahead and look at the language that David uses when he's praying to God. And remember, this has happened after David has committed this, great sin with Bathsheba. So how does David start? The prayer of a leopard. It says, be gracious to me, God, according to your faithfulness, according to the greatness of your compassion, wipe out my wrongdoings. Every single time that a leper would come to Christ, what was the first phrase out of their mouths? Be merciful unto me. This is what David is asking God. And then in verse 2, what is he saying? Wash me thoroughly from my guilt and cleanse me from my sin. He's asking God for this type of cleansing. And then in verse 3, my sin is constantly before me. As with a leper, the sin was constantly before David. And then in verse 51 and 7, it says, purify me with hyssop. This is a leper talking. And I will be clean. And then the next part, cleanse me, and I will be whiter than snow. And remember, leprosy was something that was very contagious. Now let us think about it for a second. What was going on in David's life? After he committed this sin, one of the things that became very evident to David was how contagious his sin had been. He had slept with Bathsheba, and what was the result of sin in his family? What was the biggest result of this sin in his family? What happened to his children? His sons died, and even more, and I find it interesting that he committed a sexual sin, right? He slept with Bathsheba, but what did his son commit? He went ahead and raped his stepsister. So this immoral sin propagated in his family, and to him it was very evident. That is why when we look at Psalm 51, his language is that of a leopard. He's praying to God, cleanse me, because he's seen how his sin has contaminated people around him. And in verse 9 it says, and wipe out all my deeds. And then finally in Psalm 51 verse 10, the verse we all know, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. But this is where we get to the part where David is afraid to lose God's presence or can't feel it at that moment. And look what he says in verse 11. And in verse 11 he says, do not cast me away from your presence. As a sinful leper that he was, the biggest fear that he had was to be cast out from the presence of God and not being able to feel God's presence there. And going on to mind, character, and personality, we can see that this is how Christ felt when he was at the cross. It says, faith and hope trembled in the expiring agonies of Christ, because God had removed the assurance that he had heretofore given his beloved Son of his approbation and acceptance. So this is what Jesus was feeling during that time. That feeling that you have when you've committed a sin and you feel that God is not present there, this is the very same thing that Jesus was feeling. And think about the experience that a leper could have. Imagine being sent away from your family. You know that your family is still living, and all you can do is not be there with them, watching your family grow. Think about the example of the leper that Jesus heals. This man might have been around his 40s. So his children, they might have been already grown up, and he didn't have this privilege of being there for them. And one of the things that we learn when we go to how also the leper was treated was that they had to bring this offering in order for cleansing. And I would like us to go to Leviticus, and we don't have it here, but we're going to go to Leviticus chapter 14. Leviticus chapter 14. And we're going to start with verse 18. Leviticus 14, starting with verse 18. And we're going to go through verse 19. It says the rest, so this is what would happen once they were cleansed, right? So once they were cleansed, the priest had to make sure that they were indeed cleansed. And it says, the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand, he shall put it on the head of him who is to be cleansed. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. Can you imagine when they were healed from leprosy, what needed to happen? These rituals that they experienced were very similar to the rituals that a priest would go through in order to consecrate themselves. They had to get the oil, they had to put it behind their ear. And then what else had to be made? So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. And then in verse 19, then the priest shall offer the sin offering and make atonement for him. So it was kind of like a mini atonement. Think about the atonement that would happen every year when a leper was cleansed. There was a mini atonement for him right there. And then it says, then the priest shall offer the sin offering and make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanliness. Afterward he shall kill the burnt offering, and in verse 20, and the priest shall offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. So the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. And the other part is when we come to the two birds. So one of the things that they had to do is the two birds, they would bring the two birds, and they had to dip these birds in water and also in blood. One of them would be sacrificed, right? And this blood would be sprinkled on the bird, and then one bird was let go free. So it's very similar. Remember what would happen in the Day of Atonement for the scapegoat? One had to be let go, but in this case, the meaning for these two birds was very different. The bird that was let go was assigned to the leper, that his impurity had been transferred to this bird, and now this bird had flown far away from him, and he was far away from being in contact with this leprosy again. So to them, it was a very beautiful symbol, transferring this disease to this bird who had nothing to do with your disease, and then letting it go free, and now you can say, I'm cleansed. And it is the same experience that we go through. And I would like us to go back to the example of the leper that Jesus heals. What was the thing that Jesus told him that he had to do afterwards? What did Jesus tell him to do afterwards? He had to go back and he had to go to the priest. And now the priest had to look over to make sure that he had been cleansed. So just imagine, when looking at leprosy, we can be sure that this man was unable to feel people's touch. So what is the first touch that he feels when Jesus heals him? That would have been the touch of Jesus. That would have been his first experience after being sick for so long. And going back here in Matthew 8:3, it says, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses has commanded as a testimony to them. So the way that God was able to heal this leper was a testimony to especially all the Jews and also to the priests that were to examine him. And I would like us, before we end, to go to this quote right here. To mind, character, and personality. It says, faith and hope trembled in the expiring agonies of Christ because God had removed the assurance that he had hereto given to his beloved Son of his approbation and acceptance. So the very same way that a leper would have felt that he was unapproved by people around him, and even in this case, unapproved by his family, Jesus also felt this very same thing. And he also felt the rejection of a society that, in a way, when he was being crucified, also treated him as a leper. And one of the biggest talking about this doctor that spent a long time with people with skin diseases and lepers, one of the things that he would bring out specifically when they would interview him was that when people were not able to feel the presence of others, they began to grow cold. Right? So the last thing that they wanted to do is to reach out to somebody and look for sympathy. And when he spent time with them, they had to get adjusted to people being around. So can you imagine, they, after being, in isolation for a very long time, they had to get used to it. And this is the very same thing that Jesus does for us. When we think about sin as leprosy, what did Jesus do in order to reach to us as lepers? What did he do to the children of Israel? Those who had been banished, let's say, from the Garden of Eden, they could no longer be with God. What did God have to do in order to come and to heal them? God had to come, and he had to pitch his tent in the middle of a camp full of, metaphoric, spiritual leprosy. He put his camp right in the middle in order to be in touch with them, and in order to get them used to the idea that God was indeed going to be with them. And then finally, when Jesus comes in the New Testament, the unfortunate thing was that he came to his own, and his own were not able to recognize them. And this is the biggest symptom of leprosy. When you have been away from people for so long, it takes time to reunite again and to begin to make those connections. And it was the same with the Israelites. When Jesus came, they were not ready to accept him. They had lost this contact for a very long time. But yet, Jesus came to his friends, he stayed there, spent the time, and gave you and I the opportunity to reach out and to call out to him and to be saved from this leprosy of sin. May the Lord help us.